God chooses Moses despite reluctance, self-doubt, speech impediment, and a felony record. Grace means God works with weakness, not with perfection. Welcome to Emunah, where we explore what it truly means to live a life rooted in faith, real faith, tested faith, enduring faith. I'm your host, Dr. Tamara Henry. Today's episode takes us into a lesser discussed but deeply powerful story. The story of Moses and his wife Zipporah. When we think of Moses, at least when I think of Moses, I often picture burning bushes, parted seas, and bold leadership. But tucked inside this journey, Moses' journey is a moment so intense, so unexpected, that it almost feels out of place. It's a moment where everything hangs in the balance and grace steps in. What happens when the one chosen by God falls short in a critical moment? What does grace look like when obedience is delayed? And how does God use someone else, someone close, to step in and preserve His purpose? In this episode, we'll uncover how grace is not always soft and gentle. Sometimes it is urgent, decisive, and even uncomfortable. And we'll take a closer look at Zipporah, the woman whose quick action may have saved Moses' life and preserved the destiny of a nation. If you've ever wondered whether God can still use you after a misstep, if you've ever needed grace to meet you right where you are, stay with us. This is a story you don't want to miss. Grace under pressure. Moses and Zipporah's story, in only a few passages in Exodus, contains several quiet but powerful moments of grace, which we define as divine mercy, protection, patience, and unexpected provision. And as my cousin says, God doing us a favor. Hallelujah. Here's background. I like to refer to Zipporah as Moses' black wife because Hebrew literature describes her as a dark-skinned woman who was exceptionally modest and unassuming in her actions. Many called her a Cushite or Ethiopian woman, but she was the daughter of the Midianite priest, Jethro. Remember, Midian was one of Abraham's sons after Sarah died and he married Keturah. Zipporah means bird, and just as birds are admired for their beauty, Zipporah was admired for her loveliness. Now, we first meet Zipporah at a well in her hometown of Midian. At this point, Moses had fled Egypt after a murder. Remember, Moses had been raised in the palace by Pharaoh's daughter, but as he grew up, he began to identify more with the Israelites. He began rejecting his Egyptian upbringing. Sort of like a black boy being raised in a white family, but later deciding to embrace black culture, like that. While living in the palace, however, Moses one day went out to visit the Hebrews and saw how they were being mistreated. To make a long story short, he ended up killing an Egyptian that had been beating a Hebrew. He thought no one saw the murder. But the next day, Moses realized that not only did people know about the murder, they knew that he had buried the Egyptian body in the sand. So he fled to Midian to escape punishment. Moses, who was about 40 years old, comes to the town of Midian and sits beside a well, just checking out the scene. You know how it is when you get to a new place. You people watch. At least I like to people watch, just to get a feel of the area, the environment, etc. At that time, wells were the center of social life in the ancient Middle East. Then Jethro's 7 daughters appear on the scene, coming to draw water from the well. As female shepherds, they were chased away by bullying male shepherds. Remember, this was a patriarchal society where men ruled. But Moses defended the women. He didn't just sit there and spectate. After dealing with the male shepherds, he watered Jethro's flock the women had brought to the well. The sisters were so excited about the Egyptian coming to their aid, they ran home and told their dad all the drama, every last detail. And Jethro was like, "Y'all left a man at the well? What kind of hospitality is that? Go back and invite the man to the house." So Moses came to the house and began working as a shepherd for Jethro. They knew Moses had a speech impediment. That was obvious. But no one knew that Moses was on the run from Pharaoh. To make a long story short, Zipporah eventually became his wife. They had 2 sons, Gershom and Eleazar. One day, Moses is out tending the flock. The king of Egypt had died, but the Israelites continued to be mistreated. Moses led the flock to Sinai, the mountain of God. Now, those of you who went to Sunday school, you know the story. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. This is in the Word. This is the spot where Moses and God had an intense conversation that ended with God convincing Moses that he should try to free the Israelites from the new Egyptian Pharaoh, and Moses convincing God that Aaron, his brother, should accompany him when he addressed the Pharaoh. After this encounter, the next part is sweet. Moses goes back to Jethro, tells him what happened, and said, "I gotta go." He gets his father-in-law's blessing. Exodus 40:20 says, "So Moses took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and headed back to the land of Egypt. In his hand, he carried the staff of God." Listen, y'all. The sister, the black wife, was with Moses as he began the most important assignment of his life. I get chills thinking about it. But hold up, there's trouble. God is ticked with Moses. There was a problem that needed to be cleared up before the showdown with Pharaoh. Exodus 4:24 says, on the way to Egypt, at a place where Moses and his family had stopped for the night, the Lord confronted him and was about to kill him, meaning Moses. One thing we know about the Israelites: things Moses may have missed while growing up in the Pharaoh's palace the first 40 years of his life. God's laws rule, especially the Abrahamic covenant. And remember, after 40 years in Pharaoh's palace, Moses spent another 40 years among the Midianites, who occupied desert areas in southern Transjordan, northern Arabia, and the Sinai. Genesis 17 establishes circumcision as the perpetual sign of belonging to the Abrahamic covenant. Genesis 17:14 says, any male who fails to be circumcised will be cut off from the covenant family for breaking the covenant. Again, that's Genesis 17:14. Moses was circumcised, unlike his Egyptian peers. Remember, circumcision is in 8 days according to the covenant. Moses was 3 months old when his mother placed him in a basket and Pharaoh's daughter found him. Yes, Moses was circumcised, but Gershom, his oldest son, was not. Circumcision was not the same medical practice it is today, but circumcision was a sign of the covenant God had made with Abraham and his descendants. Zipporah had borne 2 sons to Moses, but he had failed to perform circumcision on them. Egypt had caused Moses to forget his roots, his identity as a descendant of Abraham. He had forgotten his blood, y'all. Zipporah was a Midianite, part of a semi-nomadic people who were descended from Abraham. Yet she didn't understand that the covenant with which God had promised Abraham heirs, property, power, and wealth, required all males to be circumcised 8 days after birth. The Jews called it a Brit Milah. We all have many excuses why we didn't or don't obey God's commands. I didn't know. I wasn't raised like that. It doesn't take all of that. My research shows all kinds of reasons why Moses hadn't circumcised his son. But God doesn't play. We must obey. God's hand of death came against Moses at the spot where they had stopped for the night. Moses suffered some sort of illness or seizure, and it was clear he was not going to make it. Zipporah had to think and act quickly to save her husband's life when she realized that Moses was being punished for not circumcising their son. Zipporah knew she was as much to blame for Moses' neglect as he was. In fact, she may have discouraged the practice in her own way. Just picture this. Gershom was much older than God's set age for circumcision. Zipporah was no doctor. She wasn't a priest or a Hebrew leader. She was a desperate mother, though, willing to do anything to save her her husband's life. She was going to do something. You know, you've been there. I've had to do something. With shaking hands, tears spilling from my eyes, she took a razor-sharp flintstone, they didn't have scalpels, and severed the forehead on her son's penis while he slept. She was angry, scared. She flung the foreskin at Moses' feet. Exodus 4:25 says, she said, "Surely a bloody husband art thou to me." With this, the threat over Moses' life ended. Again, she said in Exodus 4:26, "A bloody husband thou art because of the circumcision." The point had been made. Moses must follow God's laws to lead the Jewish nation, and God must be feared more than Pharaoh. The health crisis was over for Moses. Zipporah was the heroine. She contentedly resumed her wifely duties. This is what we learn. In order to complete his assignment, Moses had to die. At least the Egyptian in him had to die. For the bloody Israelite Moses, in his truest identity, to fulfill the purpose for which he was born. Through Zipporah's quick-thinking actions, she evoked the covenant by demonstration, so Moses would remember his roots. If he was going to Egypt to free his people, his identification with Egypt had to die. The flesh and blood in the hands of his wife Zipporah would not let Moses forget. I've learned so much about grace and working on this. Looking at all the quiet instances of grace in the story of Zipporah and Moses, here are 4 I'd like to leave with you. Zipporah became a stabilizing partner during Moses' hidden years. This is relational grace. God provides companionship when Moses is displaced and alone. Early in my career as a journalist, I was hired in New York but sent to Iowa to work, a place with few blacks. Talking about displaced and alone. But never in my wildest dreams did I expect to meet my husband there. Moses became a shepherd and father. God allowed Moses a season of quiet formation. Leadership preparation happens in obscurity, not spotlight. Grace here looks like time, space to grow before assignment. Those were my Iowa days. 3. God calls Moses while he is living with Zipporah's family. God chooses Moses despite reluctance, self-doubt, speech impediment, and a felony record. Grace means God worked with weakness, not with perfection. And Zipporah's circumcision. Grace sometimes arrives through another person's courage. Zipporah protects Moses' calling when he falters spiritually. Without Zipporah's action, Moses may not have survived to lead Israel. This is all just food for thought. As we close today's episode, take a moment to reflect on the overall message in the story of Moses and Zipporah. Grace isn't always what we expect. It doesn't always come quietly. And it doesn't always wait. Sometimes grace shows up in the urgency of a moment. Sometimes it looks like correction, and sometimes it comes through the hands of someone else. Moses was chosen, but he wasn't perfect. Zipporah wasn't the one called to lead Israel, but in a critical moment, she became the one who preserved the leader. That's the beauty of grace. It meets us in our gaps and still moves God's purpose forward. So here's a question to carry with you this week. Where might grace be showing up in your life in ways you didn't expect? And are you willing to respond when it does? Thank you for joining us on Emunah. If this episode spoke to you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that God's grace is still at work, even in the most unexpected moments. Until next time, keep walking by faith and trusting in the power of grace.